During today's webinar, we will have the chance to hear about research conducted in collaboration with the Schools 2030 programme, which has focused on educational equity and on identifying positive deviant school practices with a view to scaling these up. This research has taken place across Brazil, Pakistan, Tanzania, Zanzibar, and Uganda, and it represents the work of 4 of the Schools 2030 Global Research Partners. So what will the session look like today? I know many people who have joined this webinar, you will already be quite familiar with Schools 2030 as you're connected to the programme either as a team member, as a partner, or as a colleague from the wider AKF team. But I will first just give a very brief overview of the programme for the benefit of those who are less familiar, and I will give some context to the research. Then we will hear some brief presentations from our speakers who represent the 4 projects. Time dependent, we may have a few questions at the end of all the presentations, but I would encourage you to write your questions in the chat throughout the presentations. And I would also say, don't worry if you don't have the chance to ask your question after we hear those presentations, because you will have the chance to go into breakout rooms where you will get to engage with 2 of the projects on further discussion. And you're going to have 2 slots of 15 minutes. So you can select 2 different projects, and we'll have 15 minutes in one project and then another 15 minutes in another. And then we will all reconvene at the end of the breakout rooms to hear some feedback, to thank everyone and to close the session. So first, just to cover some basic information and talk about what the Schools 2030 programme is first and foremost. So Schools 2030 is a programme, but really it's a global movement for holistic learning and teacher leadership. As a movement, we bring together diverse coalition of actors from the education system, and this includes educators, school leaders, civil society, researchers, international organisations and government across the 10 countries where we're working, including from 1,000 and counting schools. So the goal of the programme is to improve quality teaching and holistic learning and to foster resilient education systems across the world. And importantly, including for those living in remote regions and those facing multiple forms of marginalisation. For us, promoting teacher agency is at the centre of the programme. It's really important for us to recognise educators as leaders, as innovators, and active agents in education reform. But what does this look like programmatically? How do we do this? So Schools 2030 leans on the principles of human-centered design, or HCD, you will hear us call it. We use human-centered design as a way to elevate the impact of school-driven innovation towards wider systems change. And the programme supports teachers through a 3-step model. So first, this involves supporting teachers to assess the learning levels of their students, as well as the quality of the learning environment, using contextualized holistic tools, which have been designed specifically for the context. Then, using this assessment data, teachers engage in a human-centered design process to design, test, and implement innovative classroom practices that address identified gaps in learning through the first step. And then thirdly, teachers share their innovations at local, national, and global forums to influence uptake of their best practices and education decision-making at policy level. And I want to emphasize here that the aim of this process is not to generate as many innovations as possible, but really it's to identify which innovations, which practices are seeming to be positive and successful, and thinking about how we can incubate and scale the impact of those that are showing the most evidence of promise. So moving on from that, I just want to situate us within the programme. So Schools 2030 is a 10-year programme. It started in 2020, and we are now in the second phase of the programme. So me mentioning about how we're wanting to incubate and scale the impact of promising innovations is relevant to the fact that we're now in our second phase. The first phase involved the development of all the Schools 2030 tools, approaches, and the model. But our second phase is seeking to expand on our programme approach the uptake of our tools and innovations, and importantly, to gather evidence of impact, which then leads us into further phases of the programme. And I'd like to mention that this is perhaps where learning from research such as UNICEF Innocenti's positive deviance research could potentially support us, given that their research is pointing to promising school practices and potential levers to scaling these, which have been co-created with ministries of education. But why are we specifically focusing here on equity as well? So as a programme, we acknowledge that the crisis in learning is actually also a crisis of equity, inclusion, quality, and relevance. And as mentioned, we're working with diverse and marginalised communities in the country context where we're working. So the programme was founded on this very basis of making education more relevant, making it contextually appropriate and equitable to these communities, including for learners and teachers. Now, there are two key elements or ways that we feel our programme contributes to making education more inclusive. One is by focusing on the needs of the whole child and nurturing the knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes that are deemed contextually relevant to a holistic education in that context. That's number one. Secondly, by using human-centered design and action research as a method to equitably involve school-level stakeholders in designing education innovations, but also in generating evidence on what is working in their contexts. So those are two key elements that I wanted to point out. And to our point here about research, so since 2021, we've been working with support from the Jacobs Foundation to fund global research projects to help us understand more about how the programme is working. So in 2022, our global call for research focused on the topic of education equity, and we selected research partners to help us understand these two elements and how they relate to equity so that we can improve our programme to be as inclusive as possible. So that leads me then to introduce the presentations and our speakers for today. Our first three presentations will be from partners that joined us through that call for research I just mentioned, focused on equity, and they commenced their projects in 2023. And our final presentation will be from the Data Must Speak team, and they joined us as part of the inaugural cohort of research partners. And I just showed you our kind of phases of the programme. I would just like to situate this research in that this research happened mostly during our first phase of operation, in that HCD was up and running, but the programme model was being consolidated and we were establishing and developing our tools. I should also point out that obviously we have a research team here from Brazil. Brazil operates slightly differently to the other programme countries in that the programme is implemented by partner organisation Ashoka, and they use action research as opposed to human-centred design. And just to let you know about these presentations, they are going to be fairly brief. So the researchers won't have the chance to go into deep detail about all their methods used, as they're mainly going to focus on their findings. However, of course, if you have any detailed questions about methodology, you can write them in the chat or save them for the breakout rooms. So without further ado, I will pass to the first speaker, and we're delighted to first have Dr. Nick Medrano from the University of Texas at Austin. And he will be presenting research that took place in Pakistan, which investigated teacher beliefs and how human-centered design can be used as a way to promote growth-oriented teacher practices. So Nick, over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Ellen. I appreciate the introduction. So yeah, I think we can just dive right into it. So our project focused on using the idea of values alignment to promote teachers' adoption of HCD practices as they were going through the training. So by values alignment, we aim to align the values and beliefs that teachers already possess with the practices that HCD promises. So if you next slide, Selen. So we really aim to explore the barriers and promoting factors to adoption. So in order to do this, we were partnered with Pakistan and focused in the Gilgit-Baltistan region. And we conducted a series of interviews with teachers who were all former HCD participants. And we had three main questions. So what are the perceived barriers that prevent teachers from adopting HCD practices? What additional supports are needed to promote the adoption of HCD practices? And lastly, what are the values that teachers hold that could be better aligned with what HCD has to offer? So we get right into it. One more. So first was the back one. First was the initial belief that HCD would be ineffective or too much work. So often when teachers, before they started the actual training of HCD, thought of it as just like another type of PD, it might be relevant, it might not be relevant. And until they really got into it, they weren't really sure how it could apply to it. And importantly, once they got back to their schools, teachers who hadn't gone through the HCD program seemed resistant to participate with them or to offer them support, which sometimes could pose a challenge. Next one. Teachers had a value to teach beyond material, so they actively wanted to focus on character growth that went beyond teaching, what was in the textbook, and really wanted to focus on nurturing the holistic development of the children in their classroom. Next one. One fear they often had is the difficulty of gathering student feedback. And also, some teachers struggled to see initially the value of gathering student feedback. They often held the idea that as the teacher, they should be the ones with answers. They should know how to impart knowledge effectively. And the idea of actually asking a student how best they might learn was certainly foreign and in some cases seemed inappropriate. Next one. And again, the actual process of interviewing students, parents, colleagues, or other stakeholders seemed like a lot to accomplish. Fourth was difficulty with learning the material. And then in addition, the importance of persistence. So a lot of teachers mentioned that a lot of the ideas in the HCD training were very new to them. And so a lot of them mentioned a steep learning curve with learning the different concepts. And as well as at the end of it, realizing what a massive task they had with it. And so a lot of them mentioned the importance of persistence and sticking with it, as well as gathering their own support in their communities. Sorry, I should mention these subpoints. These are all quotes from the teachers that we interviewed. Maybe I should mention that. And then last, there is this deep value and need to be an asset to their colleagues, schools, and communities. So oftentimes, once they had gone through HCD training, they saw themselves as leaders and able to affect change in a different way back to the communities, which was a deep value of theirs to have this communal impact, not just on the students, but on the schools and communities that they were going back to. And a lot of them mentioned garnering support and positive feedback, not just from their students, but also from their colleagues, and importantly from parents and the community as well. So based off of what we learned there, we designed some intervention materials. So we thought of this as a way to consolidate and promote these values and align them with the materials that the new cohort of teachers being trained in HED that they could potentially use. So in Pakistan, HED training happens in 3 phases. So right after phase 1 is where we aim. So this is right after they are introduced to HCD, but before they really get into the stakeholder engagement or the design thinking process for designing their tools or interventions that they want to bring to their students. So there were several different components of the intervention we designed. So first was the developmental science of learning. You can go forward one, Ellen. And here is where we try to incorporate ideas about growth mindset, about the neuroplasticity of children and how they're really primed and eager to engage with the material. Next, we introduced the idea of student engagement. The idea that students often want to learn, but they often have barriers or lack certain supports. And HED is really there to create the supports based on the needs that students have. And then the idea that having better supports leads to higher standards and higher achievement and success among students. And then these three different values that we came up with of the importance of listening to students and gathering student feedback, continuous improvement on their part, the idea that mistakes are going to happen and that they're good and can we learn from, and then also being a benefit and asset to their community as they're able to lead this HCD process back home and really gather a team of people working towards promoting student success. And then finally, we ended with practical advice from past participants. So again, we used materials from the interviews that we conducted of uh, uh, of advice that past teachers gave to the new cohort of teachers about what seemed to work, what was beneficial, and how they went about crafting their own interventions. So next slide. I think, okay. I'll be brief here. We gathered a lot of different feedback from those piloted materials, but I'll just share a couple. Our first question was, are they actually agreeing and adopting with the messaging that we were giving them? And I think this is a nice example of, we asked them, how would you summarize this? And they said, one, feedback is a gift. So seeing the importance of feedback, mistakes are welcome, the idea of continuous improvement, and then sharing knowledge and ideas is successful. By the help of motivation activities, we can motivate better and cooperative students. Parents meeting and stakeholders can help and problem solve. So again, the idea of that communal aspect of gathering the team, or the old adage of it takes a village, seem to be at play here. Next one. And I do want to focus a bit because we're focused on equity. We often did frame the idea of different students have different needs, and HCD is a way to identify the different needs that students have and design better supports for those students. So this is a teacher reflecting on that idea. So not all students in a class share the same background. Some belong to a noble background, whereas some come from wealthier ones. Teachers should keep in consideration such differences among students. Again, imparting the idea that HCD is a way for teachers to address equity by recognizing the marginalized or disengaged students in an active and positive way. Next slide. Just future directions and key takeaways. Future directions for this project or for this line of work. I think we could refine the materials based on teacher feedback. Two of the well, I'll say one of the feedback we got was our material is a bit too long, and teachers wanted something a little more punchy. Second, examine the effect on longer-term engagement HCD practices. The hope is that if we are able to intervene early and align teachers' own values with the HCD practices, that'll lead to longer-term engagement and persistence with the program over a longer period of time. Pilot and launch larger tests of the materials. And then lastly, again, with the idea of teachers wanting more toolkits, teachers asked us to give them summaries or a toolkit based on the intervention materials, or something that they could then take back and use in their own work as well as share with their colleagues. So key takeaways. I think first, as I mentioned before, HCD can be used to identify the needs of the most vulnerable students. So those who are financially unstable, food insecure, marginalized. HCD offers a framework that teachers can use to address those issues and differences in their approach. HCD can engage an entire community. Teachers often took these lessons back to their schools and villages and shared their knowledge and approach with the rest of their team. And then third, this came up a bit where teachers are looking for longer term support of HCD practices. So beyond even just that first year of having continuous follow-up and support, as well as they were very interested in having that component of sharing with other teachers, not just other HCD participants, but other teachers who hadn't necessarily gone through the HCD program within their own school. Okay, I think that was good on time. Any questions that I might be able to answer?
Thanks so much, Nick. We're actually going to have the questions at the end of all the presentations for time reasons, but thank you so much for sharing that insightful research around the teacher beliefs associated with HCD, and really interesting for us at Schools 2030 to hear those findings around how teachers valued that peer aspect of HCD and would like more support with that. But we'll park those thoughts. Please do put questions in the chat if you would like to, or save them for later, and we will now move to the next project. So I would like to introduce Hannah Walker, who formerly was at Open Development and Education, where this project was led. And Hannah will be presenting with Basil Onan from Ekitabu, who was a key partner in this research. This research was conducted in Uganda and looked at holistic learning outcomes for students with SEND, producing a toolkit that they're going to talk us through today. So Hannah and Basil, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ellen. I've just started my timer. I'm going to get this. And I think what a great kind of endpoint there from Nick as well, where he's spoken about the need or teachers wanting more toolkits, short toolkits that they can utilize in their own practice, which is exactly what this project sought to do. So great link there. So as Ellen said, our project explored the intersection between holistic curricula, learner-centered pedagogies, and teacher development in primary schools in Uganda. I'm presenting with Basil, who is at Ekitabu, and also we partnered with 4 other organizations on this screen. Next slide, please, Ellen. So the research aimed to understand as well as to start building more inclusive practices. We had these 4 main pillars. Firstly, centered on teacher-learner relationships, trying to embed more inclusive pedagogies and more approaches to holistic learning and inclusive assessment. Next slide, please, Ellen. The way that we went about our methodology and the way that we prioritize things was very important to us. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but I just wanted to flag a few of them. Number 1, co-collaboration with teachers really links into what Ellen was saying before, making teacher agency a central pillar of how we conducted our research. We also iterated our toolkit based on lots of research phases, which Baz is going to go into in a moment. And then we also made sure that it was aligned to local and national environment in terms of both assessment, in terms of tools that were available, and in terms of guidance and language. Next slide, please, Ellen. I will now pass over to Basil for our data collection process.
Hello, thank you very much, Hannah. My name is Basil Onan from Ekitabu, as Hannah and already introduced. So for our data came from several sources. One of them was conducting a contextual and teacher needs assessment. Now, these included both literature and also conversation with the teachers. Another source of our data was assessment of the learners themselves in the domains of holistic development, and that is empathy, problem solving, numeracy, and literacy. We assessed the learners who had special or additional needs with already existing assessment tools from Schools 2030, but of course with modifications to accommodate specific special and additional assessment requirement needs. Another source of our data was classroom observations, where we asked to observe the teachers in the classroom settings. And then we also conducted partner review. So obviously this was very important because we needed to link whatever intervention material to a lot of resources that were already available. So we had to review what our partners or people in this landscape were already doing or had already done. In terms of the toolkit development, which ended up being the intervention material after the study, which came in the other phase, we started off with a draft, which we then share with the teachers from the 4 participating schools and also the head teachers, and then kept on iterating with their feedback and what we wanted to see done different. We did about 3 iterations of the toolkit before we did the final version. And in terms of the toolkit, the final version, we tried to publish it in multiple alternative versions for accessibility, including accessible EPUB and also e-Braille or electronic Braille. Next slide, and I'll pass it back to Hannah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Basil, for that great overview. So what we try to do on this slide is really bring together the key findings and learnings from all of the different phases. Firstly, one thing that came up a lot through our needs assessment and from teachers is that learners who are deaf and hard of hearing face some of the biggest educational barriers and stigmas, from national assessment practices, such as oral examinations, to bullying and discrimination in classes. We really highlighted the importance of including learners in all parts of educational components in our toolkit, but more work needs to be done on that. Another obvious finding, but I think it's also very important to say, is how there are such major contextual and cohort differences between schools and classrooms in a very small area in Uganda. Across the 4 schools, there were just massive differences in terms of classroom size, religious practices, competencies of the teachers. And I think that really speaks to the need for teachers to have the flexibility and space in their training and resources to consider what approaches really look like in their own classrooms. Teachers also found the critical questioning, real-life case studies and peer-to-peer activities the most useful. When reviewing the toolkit and through interviews, teachers reported that discussion-based and peer-to-peer elements were just critical. I've got a quote here: "The learning really happened when my colleague provided a solution that also really helped me here." The importance, again, of just allowing that space for teachers to problem solve together. We also did a few activities around lesson planning, where teachers from different schools lesson planned together, and that was also reported as one of the most helpful activities. In terms of community and parental stigmas, this came up again and again as one of the biggest barriers to learner attendance and progress. Teachers often spoke of parents saying that they're keeping their learners with disabilities at home for fear of them being bullied, or that they were not right for education. We tried to respond to this by creating a parent module in the toolkit that tries to really examine these types of issues through questions and case studies, and how to format types of conversations teachers may have with parents and communities. In terms of inclusive assessment, again, this is a really interesting one. We actually worked with a colleague at Hitabu who, yes, all the research schools were in Kampala. We worked with an examination expert in Uganda called Daniel, who really tried to provide insight on how there needs to be that top-down work from examination boards to schools. Learners are very rarely given accommodations in exams, and when they do, it's quite unfamiliar. They're not used to learning a scribe or a reader. And so we were trying to give different ways of doing it, for example, getting a peer to practice with them first. And then finally, there is also a correlation that we found between teachers whose learners reported positive relationships with their teachers and the score on inclusive observations. This just points to the fact that a positive teacher-learner relationship is likely to be very foundational for inclusive pedagogy. Final slide, please, Ellen. I'm not going to go into much detail on these steps, but it's just some of the things that are going to happen over the next few months. Now we've handed over the work to Schools 2030. So I will stop there, as I know I'm past my time. Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you so much, Hannah and Basil. Thanks for sharing that research, and we'll look forward to continue discussing that in the breakout rooms. We will now move to Brazil, and I would like to welcome Bruna Chung from the University of Sao Paulo. Bruna has been working on a project with her team at the university, looking at the impacts of action research on equity and dimensions of student relationships. So I will pass over to you, Bruna.
Thanks, Alan. I would just like to start by saying that this project was coordinated by the professor Eli Gunning, and we had the collaboration with researchers from the University of Sao Paulo, but also from teachers from the schools participating in the Schools 2030 program in Brazil. Next slide, please. Our main question was, do action research processes in innovative schools participating in the Schools 2030 program generate more equitable relationships among students of different genders, sexual orientations, ethnicities, and those with disabilities? We hypothesized that action research could create meaningful changes in the school environment and foster more equitable relationships among students from diverse backgrounds. And our goal was to explore how action research could be a powerful tool for building inclusion and equity in educational settings. Next slide, please. We begin by reviewing the existing literature on action research and equity in education. And we found only 11 studies published between 2018 and 2022 that met our criteria. However, many lacked validated data, or were inconclusive, or didn't show a clear impact on educational equity. One challenge was that many studies lacked strong methodologies and sufficient evidence. Also, while some studies use mixed methods, most rely on qualitative approaches, making it difficult to assess their true impact on equity. Despite these challenges, we identified two key studies that linked action research to improve equity. The first, by Arar and Tazian from 2019, found that distributed leadership improved intercultural awareness and led to 17 to 27% improvement in language and math exams. The second study by Gaias et al. From 2020 explored participatory methods to address implicit biases and improve teacher-student relationships. After evaluating these relationships and implementing a 10-day action plan, the teaching practice integrated a focus on race, ethnicity, culture, and bias. This approach helped enhance student motivation, strengthen their sense of belonging, and reduce disparities, especially for Black students. In the second phase of our research, we gathered primary data from 2006 schools and educational organizations participating in the Schools 2030 program across Brazil. This included surveys, interviews, and observations by our team of researchers who are also teachers at these schools. We also mapped teacher training policies for equity in collaboration with education departments in the schools we observed. Next slide, please. Our analysis of teacher training policies from 2021 to 2023 showed that many programs focused on racial equity and inclusive education, but there was less emphasis on gender and sexual orientation. Training initiatives often targeted teachers, coordinators, school managers, but the reach was limited, with only a small proportion of teachers participating in these training programs. The key recurring themes included, for disabilities, accessible and inclusive practices, individualized education plans, Brazilian Sign Language, and specialized educational services. For ethnic racial relations, anti-racist education, combating bullying and racism, human rights education, and the inclusion of indigenous and Afro-Brazilian in the school Afro-Brazilian themes in the school curriculum. Next slide. Our findings reveal that action research has generally contributed positively to fostering equity, although the impact was varied across the schools, and it has encouraged awareness, dialogue, and reflective practices. However, some inequalities in students' relationship persist, suggesting that the effects of action research may be inconsistent across different contexts. Since action research was only introduced 2 years ago, and some schools started even later, immediate significant impacts were not expected. The gradual approach, combined with teachers' heavy workloads, limited immediate effects. Despite this, our research suggests that action research holds promise for advancing educational equity, especially if institutions provide stronger support, such as compensated time and technical assistance for teachers. Action research has also supported teachers in identifying diverse learning needs and addressing participation gaps. For example, it has encouraged girls who were shy to participate in traditional male-dominated activities, such as soccer and other sports, and help challenge gender stereotypes. For students with disabilities, action research has supported the assessment and improvement of inclusive practices that were already being implemented by these teachers, showing strong potential for fostering integration and respecting individual needs. Next slide, please. And finally, to improve educational equity, we recommend incorporating action research into professional development programs. Effective training should include content knowledge, active methods, collective participation, long duration, and alignment with policies. However, to action research, many existing programs lack these elements, such as long duration or alignment with policies, and this limits their impact. By dedicating more time to action research, teachers can collect data, reflect on their practices, and refine strategies based on classroom insights. This approach promotes equity and empowers teachers to create more inclusive and equitable learning environments. And here's a quote from a school manager that stands out a lot and talked a lot with this recommendation. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Bruna. There's a lot there to talk about and a lot to share from Brazil, which is such a huge and varied country, and so many dimensions of equity that we can talk about. So thanks for that, and we'll look forward to delving deeper in the breakout rooms. We will now turn to our final presentation, and I would like to welcome Jessica Bergman and Ellen Ledger from UNICEF Innocenti, and they will be presenting findings from the Data Must Speak research, which is being conducted in mainland Tanzania and in Zanzibar. So Jess and Ellen, over to you.
Thanks so much, Ellen, and tough act to follow after so many wonderful presentations. Thanks for all of the other grantees for sharing some of your findings. I'm Jess Bergman. I'm an education research specialist with UNICEF Innocenti, and I'm working with the Data Must Speak positive deviance research, which is actually being implemented in 14 countries globally. But thanks to Schools 2030, we've been able to implement the research in Tanzania. So we'll share some of our results emerging from both mainland Tanzania and Zanzibar today. Next slide, Ellen. In case you're not familiar with the Data Must Speak research, we're really keen to identify what we call positive deviant schools, or schools that are outperforming other schools, even though they operate in similar contexts and with similar resources. And what we're trying to unpack is the why. Why are these schools performing better than others? What can we learn from their successes? And how can we take these learnings and amplify these solutions to other schools, but then also translate them to the national level? One important component of our research is that it's co-created from the outset with relevant education stakeholders at country level. So we work really closely with ministries of education, but also local universities and academics, NGOs and CSOs who are implementing programs, school level actors, including teachers, school leaders, community members, and teachers' unions. Because for us, it's important to make sure that our research is aligned to national priorities and that the evidence that we generate can be used to inform day-to-day decision-making by all stakeholders who are working together to improve education systems. In the first stage of our research, we look to improve data use and existing data use. So we analyze different factors associated with school performance. In mainland Tanzania, we define, and Zanzibar, we define school performance based on an end of primary national examination, so learning outcomes for primary school students, but we also look at promotion rates or schools' abilities to keep students progressing from one grade level to the next. And we're trying to examine things like infrastructure, teachers' level of education, et cetera, to understand which of these factors are correlated with performance. We then go into identifying those positive deviant schools. It's important to note that positive deviant schools aren't the best performing schools in a country. So many individuals are probably used to ministries of education publishing their kind of national top performing schools on the examination. We're not looking at school number 1, 2, 3, et cetera, in a country. We're actually looking at schools that perform better than we expect based on the context that they operate in and the characteristics and resources that they have available. So it's schools that are kind of beating the odds, so to speak, and we're trying to understand what the school level practices and behaviors are that are being used by head teachers, community members, et cetera, that's contributing to that school's performance. We actually go to those schools and then collect primary data. So in Tanzania, it was qualitative data that we collected across 42 schools, 24 primary schools in mainland Tanzania and 18 schools in Zanzibar. And we reached over 1,000 participants during this primary data collection, again, trying to understand what these practices and behaviors or these local solutions or innovations are that are already being successfully implemented by school level actors. And then the last stage, which we won't get the chance to talk about today, we try and identify pathways for scaling these practices and behaviors to more school. So again, thinking about how we can translate these kind of best practices or lessons learned from school level actors to regional levels and national levels. Next slide, Ellen. So just to orient before I pass it over to Ellen, but what is it that we're exploring or looking for in our primary data? We're analyzing across 5 key dimensions, including school leadership and management practices, or what the head teacher of the school is doing. Pedagogical practices are what's happening in the classroom and what practices are being used by teachers themselves during instructional and after school hours. We're looking at school climate, particularly safety, security, and relationships that are being fostered or nurtured between school level actors. Community and parental engagement, and then the role of the decentralized administration, which could be district level, ward level, provincial officers, et cetera. And here's where I'm going to pass it over to Ellen to actually share some of what we've learned across both of these contexts of what successful practices and behaviors are being used in these positive deviant schools. So Ellen, over to you.
Hi everyone. So I'm going to share a little bit about some of the key takeaways we had from our research in mainland Tanzania and Zanzibar. First, I'm going to have a quick look at stuff that appeared, results that appeared across both contexts, and then explain some of the results that appeared separately in both mainland and in Zanzibar. So first of all, if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So first of all, we did find results across all of the domains that Jess has just described, but we found that in both mainland Tanzania and Zanzibar, that school leadership and management as a domain was particularly important. And this varied a little bit in the sense that on mainland Tanzania, it was more focused on head teachers' instructional leadership and the pedagogical support they were providing to teachers, while in Zanzibar, it was a little bit more focused on school management, so things like financial management and school development plans and that sort of thing. We also found more specific positive deviant practices that appeared in both contexts. So first of all, we found that there was measures in place to manage student absenteeism, which was of course a challenge across a wide variety of contexts. And so that meant that it was quite useful for those schools to be able to manage that challenge. We also found that the schools were providing additional academic support for struggling students, and this was typically after having done more frequent evaluations so that teachers could be more responsive in identifying needs and then plugging the gaps, whether through things like additional tutoring or study groups or actual additional support in classrooms. And finally, we found that the community played a very strong role in both contexts. So whether through parental committees, which were often focused on school level challenges and school management, or more generally with community support to schools or parental support to children for their learning. The next slide, please. So in mainland Tanzania, what we found when we looked at the practices and behaviours that came out across all the different domains was that several of those practices and behaviours were strongly related to teaching and learning. So first of all, we found, like I was saying, that head teachers had a strong focus on pedagogical support for their teachers, and this often was focused through providing training and capacity building for those teachers at the school level or at the district level, providing stronger performance monitoring, whether through having more frequent meetings with teachers or having teachers committees in place that could help provide teachers with pedagogical support depending on their needs, and head teachers strengthening teachers' motivation through providing positive reinforcement and incentives, which was typically focused on additional financial support. We also found that this focus on teaching and learning was happening at the decentralized level as well. So here we found that ward education officers were prioritizing improving teaching and learning when providing their support to schools. And this typically looked like their participation in teacher training, them checking student notebooks to see what students were learning, and then monitoring exam results at the school level so that they could provide support accordingly. Go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And then in Zanzibar, what we found when we looked at all the practices across the different domains was that there was a strong focus on child well-being. And there was different ways that the schools approached this topic to help improve outcomes for children. So first of all, in the classroom, we found that teachers were rewarding good behaviors and successes and encouraging students to participate in the learning. And this was very often, given we're talking about equity today, targeted at students that were struggling, students that were more timid, maybe disabled students, this kind of thing. We also found that teachers were providing additional support to struggling students, as I had noted earlier, which was also found in Tanzania. We further found that there was more positive relationships and support amongst school actors in general, but particularly for students. So schools were going out of their way to facilitate this positive relationship among students in a couple of ways, but in particular, they had more accessible and comprehensive guidance counsellors available who would resolve disputes amongst students or amongst students and teachers, and who would provide targeted support to students and give them advice about things like gender or harassment, self-esteem, this kind of thing. And we found similar results around student clubs, which essentially gave a safe space for students to interact together outside of the classroom and to discuss topics that they might find challenging, things like health and harassment, essentially teaching them about the issue and then about how they can respond to the issue. Finally, we also found that these schools were putting in place measures to increase student safety. So this included supporting students' safe travel to and from school, whether by for example, supervising children until their parents arrive, or in some cases, teachers actually accompanying students when they had long distances to travel. And we also found that schools were putting in place security measures focused on the children and safer infrastructure in the schools. So, for example, having a storm safety procedure in place, or putting in place traffic-related infrastructures like pedestrian crossings and speed bumps. And I will pass back to Jess now after that very rush through results, and she can reflect a little bit on what that means for Schools 2030.
Thanks, Ellen. So what reflections do we have to offer Schools 2030 when thinking about sort of these school-led innovations? The first, I think, is the importance of aligning different stakeholders towards teaching and learning, specifically thinking about the instructional leadership role that head teachers and decentralized actors play. So Schools 2030 is already engaging school principals in a lot of their HCD training models, but thinking about which other stakeholders need to act as partners to really facilitate this process and enabling conditions that allow these innovations to emerge. The next is thinking about the role of parental and community engagement in teaching and learning as well, and making sure that there's clear mandates and pathways for these actors to contribute to schools, and ways in which these individuals and stakeholders can also be engaged in supporting school-led innovations and also nurturing teacher innovation. And last, we're seeing interesting results related to teachers using formative assessment in their classrooms. And this is really important because with formative assessment, it's not just about implementing formative assessments, but actually using the data to inform some type of instructional change. And so Schools 2030 already has a country-specific assessments that teachers are able to access and being trained to utilize, and thinking about ways in which we can continue to support teachers through professional development, trainings, and other pathways to make sure that they can improve their assessment practices, but create these linkages between what the assessment should allow or enable them to do when it comes to tailoring or targeting their instruction to meet every learner's needs. So with that, I'll pass it back to Ellen, who I think will lead us to our next step. Thanks.
Huge thank you to Jess and Ellen for sharing that. And really interesting to see, obviously, a slightly different angle of that research compared to the other projects that we've heard of today. But just to kind of summarize and synthesize some of these key points I hear coming out from across these projects, as we're now going to move into our breakout room discussions, I was hearing a lot of things that were relevant to Schools 2030. We heard about teachers really valuing these peer learning opportunities, the links between human-centered design, action research, and implications for teacher professional development, teachers really valuing feedback on their practices, but also feedback from students, how human-centered design is linking to wider community engagement, and then crucially here, kind of talking about teacher professional development, specifically in assessment, and the role of head teachers in human-centered design processes. So there's some of the big topics and implications and recommendations we've heard about. We have run over slightly. Obviously, there is so much to share. There's such rich knowledge and experience and findings from all these projects. So thank you to all the presenters for sharing. I would like everyone, I see there's been some activity in the chat, which is great. If you haven't had your question answered, please do take it to the breakout room. So I'm going to walk us through how this is going to happen now. So we're going to have 4 breakout rooms open, 1 for each of the projects that we've just heard about. There's going to be 2 blocks of time. The first one, we're going to have 15 minutes, and we'll see how we get on for the second one. I will let you know the timings of that. So you are all going to be able to select which breakout room and which project you would like to engage with further. And in between each block, everyone will return to this main room. And then at the end of the 2 blocks in the breakout rooms, everyone will return to this room again. So just to give you a reminder of what these breakout rooms are. So if you would like to hear more about the research in Pakistan with Nick from the University of Texas, that's room 1. For the research in Uganda with Hannah and Basil, that is room 2. For research from Brazil on action research with Bruna, that will be room 3. And this latest project we just heard about, Data Must Speak, with Jess and Ellen, will be in room 4. So you are also going to be guided by a facilitator on some prompt questions, essentially to get you to think more about what these recommendations that everyone has left us with mean for Schools 2030. What is most relevant? What's our opportunities for actioning these recommendations? And where might we face challenges? So we are going to open the breakout rooms now. And when we do that, you will see, I would encourage you to look at the Zoom bar on your screen, which is normally at the bottom of your screen. Go to the right-hand side and you will have a little red 1 notification. It should be on a button that says more, as in the picture that we've got up here, or it would be a button that says breakout rooms. So if you press on that, you should be able to find the options 1, 2, 3, or 4, and you can go ahead, select, and get right in there and start discussing. In the last few minutes that we have, I would love to just hear about some of the key comments, reflections, or points raised within the breakout rooms that you attended on these 4 projects. So I'm going to go to my facilitators that were in those rooms to just highlight some of those key points. So Bronwyn, can I go to you? I know you went to 2 projects there.
I did, yeah. So, and I know we don't have much time, so I'll try to keep it brief, although there was a lot of rich discussion. But in the first room, which was the room led by Nick, focusing on the research in Pakistan, one of the big areas of discussion was around student engagement and a lack of sort of student engagement at classroom level, and how getting teachers to think more about student engagement was quite of a new concept for some of the teachers, and using human-centered design allowed them to think a little bit more about student perspective and student motivation. And we talked a lot also about teachers' interest in understanding sort of the science of learning and how to package that kind of evidence on the science of learning and growth mindset in a way that is accessible and practice-oriented for teachers. And I'm sure there's lots more that I've left out, but those were just a couple of the key highlights.
Thanks so much. Sounds like great discussion. Can we go to Zorine as a facilitator as well? What were some key points? And yeah, if you can be as brief as you can. Thank you.
Sure. Ellen, should I speak to the first session that I was in?
You can bring out any of the key points from either session. So yeah, go.
Okay. So the first session that I was in was on the data must speak research in Tanzania, and we had a really interesting conversation on whether positive deviant approaches were things that were top down and that they were mandated and implemented very well, or if these were ideas coming from school leadership, and how important it is for the school leadership as key in creating the positive environments that allow teachers to feel comfortable and feel safe, to be able to implement some of these policies and create that environment in the classroom that enables the positive deviance that the UNICEF Innocenti team is seeing, which was really interesting.
Thanks, Doreen. Richard, can we go to you as another facilitator? What was one key point that came out of your discussions?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think there were a lot of bit of interesting ideas that came out, but just to pull out basically one that came from the positive deviance bit of findings, that the practice where teachers, schools move beyond just the school environment to ensure the safety of their learners when they're getting back home, which influence the bit of learning process when they get back. It's something that came also out, outspoken in terms of something that should inform our reflection around how teachers want to engage with the learners beyond the school. And this is because learners tend to move very long distance when getting to school, and oftentimes many schools don't mind about safety beyond the school environment. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Richard. And I know you and your team have already been so engaged with the research from Uganda and actioning that. So great to hear your perspective on that as well. And last but not least, Mark, can we go to you? And it'd be great to hear about what was discussed on the Brazil project, if you have any key points from that.
Yes, absolutely. No, we were looking at this action research concept, and I think 2 things I'd draw out. One was around the teacher training element, both the inset, the need for bringing this into inset processes. Teachers are not often given the opportunity to reflect on their own circumstances, and there's such a wide variety of different kind of schooling context from, you know, ones that are extremely impoverished and challenging places where less than 20% of teachers actually have a teaching qualification. So the inset side, and then also the initial teacher training to bring this into initial teacher training processes. Though on that one we ran out of time about the how, but we were discussing the importance of it. And then in terms of teacher practice, there are a number of taboos around race, sexuality, gender, those kinds of issues, and where the action research process was helping teachers to be able to kind of facilitate and engage with sort of those kinds of materials that actually teachers often avoid and are not prepared to look at within the classroom, even though it's hugely important in the learners' lives, but they're not seen as something that teachers should or can, you know, address. And action research really helps teachers to be able to start to address some of those issues with their learners.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. And that brings us just about to the end of this session today. But I just wanted to end by saying, you know, the story doesn't end here. These research projects have just finished with Schools 2030, and this conversation here today is going to continue, and our country teams are in dialogue with the research partners to help break down and further share, disseminate and understand these findings and the potential impact for the Schools 2030 programme. And we've been hearing a lot today around, you know, how HCD and action research are potential ways of identifying teachers' needs, ways of supporting motivation of teachers, and also, you know, it presents thoughts for us around how HCD and action research can bring about change within teacher professional development. So I just want to say a big thank you to all the speakers for their presentations today, and all the work that goes behind all the presentations, all the work of delivering the projects. So thanks so much to that, and for all your active participation from across the Schools 2030 community. And have a good rest of your morning, afternoon or evening, and we look forward to seeing you again another time. Thanks everyone. See you soon.